I am here with author, illustrator, historian, musician, fencer, and reenactor Don Hollway, author of The Last Viking, the true story of King Harald Hardrada and Battle for the Island Kingdom, England's Destiny, covering the year 1000 to 1066, Battle of
Right.
Hastings. And I absolutely love these books and
Thank you. Thank
nerded
you.
out about them. And Don has been nice enough to come and answer some of my questions and some of our audience's questions. Thank you very much. Uh,
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. What drew you to write about Harald Hardrada to begin with? This was your first book, correct?
First major publisher book I had a self-published one years ago when I was still trying to get the hang of the business. But I had wanted to write about Harold Hardrada for years. I think I read about him when I was a teenager, and it was just a couple of paragraphs, but it was like, wow, this guy is like a real life fantasy hero. If half of this stuff is true, this guy could be the basis of his own series or something. And I've been writing magazine articles now for 10 years, something like that. And no, actually, further back than that. I started in the 90s and then took some time off to have a life, came back to it. But when my agent called up and said, "Hey, Vikings are hot right now because of that TV series," and I was like, "Let me tell you about Harold Hardrada." That to me is the Viking story of all Viking stories.
I did tell my husband this. I was like, nobody would ever believe that this guy's life was real.
I think, particularly when you're hearing his side of the story, I think there is a certain amount of Viking BS going on in there, but that's part of the story too, I think. So that's why I put it in the book.
For viewers who may not be familiar, Hardrada Harold Sigurdsson led the Varangian Guard. So, what was that, and why was it historically significant?
The Varangian Guard was the bodyguard and an elite all Viking unit of the Byzantine army down at Constantinople. Basically, it was the eastern part of the Western Roman Empire. After it divided into two, the Western Empire fell and the Eastern Empire continued on. That was like 410 AD when the West fell. And as the Byzantines kept going on all that time, this is getting into the Middle Ages now. The Vikings came over from Scandinavia, came into northern Russia, and worked their way down over the river routes into Russia. And according to Russian legend, their first kings were really Vikings who took the local people and subjected them to Viking rule. And actually, the Russians that were there threw them out, and then they started fighting among themselves immediately. And if, according to the legends, decided that, geez, it was really better when we had the Vikings here, so they invited them down. But some of the Vikings, after they came down and took over Russia, they were all explorers and traders and always pushing on to new borders. And eventually they worked their way the whole way down through the Black Sea to Constantinople, which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It's right there where Europe and Asia and the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea all come together. They signed on as mercenaries in the Byzantine army, but the emperors there eventually decided that if you read the book, it's the ruling elite of the Byzantine Empire were so treacherous and backstabbing, and it was a really treacherous situation. And the emperors decided that, hey, we can hire these guys, they'll fight for pay, and as long as I'm the one paying them the most, they're going to fight for me. And they decided it would be better to have them as their own personal bodyguard. The word Varangian comes from an Old Norse word, Varangi, I think you pronounce it. I've never actually heard it pronounced. I think it's Varangi, means sworn companion. And that's basically what they were to the Byzantine emperors.
I do this LARP slash reenactment thing, Felon Fair's Weekend Warrior event, and
Yeah, I'm a reenactor too.
yes, I did see that. And we have the faction I'm in, the Sea Lords. Like we're all based on the Varangians.
Ah,
Me and my five friends from that were so excited. We were interviewing Harold Hardrada's biographer. That's crazy. But one question that I got asked from them when I told them I was doing this interview was, why do you think the Varangian Guard hasn't captured the public imagination the way other aspects of Viking culture, Viking history have?
I think a lot of it is because it all happened in the Byzantine Empire. I don't know about you, but in school, I was hardly taught anything about the Byzantine Empire. I didn't know anything about it. It was basically like ancient Greece reborn with like Roman bureaucracy and Grecian customs and everything. And it's just not something that affected us much in the West. Actually, they were in opposition to a lot of the European West for much of their history because the Holy Roman Empire that sprang up in Germany after the fall of the West, they looked at themselves as being, we are the Roman Empire. We're the Christians now, the Holy Roman Empire. But you guys over there in Greece, you're something else. You're not the empire. And the Byzantines were like, we kept the empire going the whole way through the Dark Ages. We are the empire. And there was a lot of fighting, particularly in this period, against the forces in Europe. Now, Harold, obviously, he fought all over the Mediterranean and joined up with the Byzantines, but that's not something that is familiar to a lot of us here in the West.
That is a very good point. I nerd out on the Byzantines, but all because
Yeah.
just
If you say Byzantine Empire to most people, they'll go, what? And yet it lasted for, even after the fall of the West, I think it lasted for 1,000 years. I don't think it fell until the Turks came over in the 1400s sometime.
1453, I think.
There you go. And yeah, that's incredible. 1,000-year empire. And that's after being part of the empire, the total Roman Empire for hundreds of years. It's just mind-boggling to think of one political entity surviving for 1,000 years. I mean, I think maybe you have to go back to, I don't know, the ancient Egypt. I guess that lasted for thousands of years. They had the different dynasties and everything else. And to me, to have that Byzantine Empire, it's a great oversight in Western education that we don't know more about
it. But speaking of our discussions of history, do you have a personal favorite media depiction of the Vikings?
Like on TV or something, you mean?
Oh, it can be TV, movies, anything.
Yeah, I liked the series. I have to say the Vikings series, Vikings and Vikings Valhalla, I have to say, for whatever reason, it just does not appeal to me. That's probably going to tick off 90% of your audience right there. Okay. But I just have to admit, I just never fell in love with that series. And Vikings Valhalla,
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it.
This is like the first 15 minutes of the first episode of Vikings Valhalla. First, they show the massacre over in England. And that took place in 10,002 when the English rose up and slaughtered all the Danes there. Can't think of the name of it right now, but it's in the book. We're St. Bryce's Day. That's it. And that was in 10,002. And they have Harold Sigurdsson, walking right into the episode. He's middle-aged. He wasn't even born until 10:15, and it's 10 minutes into this thing, and it's killing me already. And it went downhill from there. You're a reenactor. I have reenactor friends who, for the same reason, can't stand to watch some of the movies. Oh, that's wrong. That's not historically correct. That's wrong. And they all tear their hair out. And I get it that Vikings Valhalla is not supposed to be a documentary. It's entertainment. I get that. But maybe I'm too close to the subject there when they were showing. And he's like a main character as it goes on. It's like they took all the named characters and just anybody who lived vaguely in that era and threw them all together and are creating their own storyline out of it. So your question was which one I like best. That's the one I like least. So okay. I digressed a little bit there. On the other hand, I liked The Last Kingdom that was on Netflix and wrapped up a couple of years ago. I thought that one was pretty good. Now, again, that's not a documentary. The main character, Uhtred the Bold, actually didn't even live in that period. He lived about 150 years later, and he's actually he's in my book. And you got to take it a little bit with a grain of salt, I think. But for whatever reason, I liked The Last Kingdom a lot better than I did Vikings. The shows usually show Vikings as these great armies that come in and they conquer everybody. And that's really not the way it was. They called them the Great Heathen Army. That was the one that was in The Last Kingdom. When they came over, they were actually an invading army and took over a big chunk of England and created the Danelaw when half of England was actually Danish. So they were an actual army. But the usual thing was you just had a small band of guys who got together once or twice a year, and they jumped in their ships and went on a lightning raid and basically just tried to take their victims by surprise, rob everything they could, load it on the ships, and get out of there before any sort of defense could be organized. So I think that's something that they don't show. That's not the typical TV Viking, to me anyway. I think the best depiction I can think of Viking warfare was in The Last Kingdom. I think it was the last episode of the first season where they showed a battle. I think it was the Battle of Eddington, which was in like the 870s, I think, something like that. And there you see two shield walls, two armies, one Viking, one English, and fighting as shield walls. And you hardly ever see that depicted. I think that was the first time I ever saw it depicted on television. And that was one of the reasons I liked the show. And I think right after that episode, that was actually on the BBC, and they dropped it right after that, and Netflix picked it up and went on with it. So maybe Netflix saw something the BBC didn't.
I read the books for
Mm-hmm.
that TV series, and that's what got me onto this hyperfixation.
Cornwell.
Yes, but I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that TV show, but I've heard so many good things now.
Yep, still on Netflix.
Awesome. I do love that. But you mentioned this, that most Vikings
Right.
was seasonal. And you do reference in this book as well, even war is seasonal, so it has to be planned. So what was the warring or raiding season, and what was it decided by?
These guys, particularly the Vikings, most of the year, they were just farmers. You had a sort of fighting elite. You had the overlord, the king, or whatever, the jarl, whatever he called himself at the time. And he typically had his own little bodyguard. Most of the rest of the population were farmers most of the year. And basically, just to increase their income, once or twice a year, like I said, they would hop on a ship and go raiding to get whatever they didn't have in Scandinavia, which was a lot. Times were tough up there. It was pretty hard scrabble living. And that was basically just a way to increase their income. So really the only time of year that they could do it was over the summer months. In the winter, particularly in Scandinavia, you're snowed in. It's too cold to travel, too snowy, too difficult to move around and keep supplied and everything. So you're basically laid up over the winter. In the spring, you're doing the planting. In the fall, you're doing the harvesting. So there's a sort of a narrow window there where you can really hop on a boat or march to wherever you're going and do your fighting and increase your income. So it's really limited to a couple of months. I think for a long time, it was like legally limited to 40 days or something like that. They figured that was about as much time as they had before you had to go back where you came from and do the harvesting and everything. Now, it did get narrowed down in the 1000s. It got narrowed even more because at that point, this is not in England, this is in France. You have what they call the peace of God and the truce of God movements because the land was being so racked with warfare. Every little warlord was setting himself up in a castle and then going out and just raiding on his neighbors, and everybody was getting slaughtered. The people were in such an uproar that the Pope got involved. And they started a movement. It was called the Peace of God or the Truce of God. They both amounted to the same thing. They were trying to get the warlords to agree to restrict fighting just on like specific days of the week. It started out being like 24 hours just from Saturday into Monday. So basically fight all week, but take Sundays off and let people go to church and recover a little bit. And they did that on pain of excommunication. They did try and throw the church's weight behind it. And then they later expanded that to Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So basically, they tried to limit warfare to Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then everybody could just take some time off. And of course, the warlords, they all just used that time to restock their weapons and cure their wounded and everything like that. So it was a long way from stopping warfare, obviously, in Europe. But it was such a popular movement. I think it really developed into what became the Crusades at the end of the century when the popes were looking around. We have this oversupply of fighting men in Europe. Let's find a good reason to send them fighting somewhere else. And the Pope got involved and said, we need to retake Jerusalem back from the Saracens. God wills it. Join the crusade. And I think it really got started these decades earlier in the early part of the century. So there I digressed a little bit again from your original question.
I love learning things, but I do just want to point out for the audience that you do talk about the Peace of God movement in this book. So if they want to learn more about that, they should read this book. I think it's like a brief aside, but it's relevant to the narrative.
And I hope it's told in an entertaining way. I don't try to lecture anybody about it.
No, like I said, I really enjoyed the way you presented your stories in this. This is something that I think does briefly also come up in seeing this book. The difference between a medieval army that is defending versus invading. So that's briefly touched on. Like, how would that be different?
Like I say, most of the invaders in this period are the Vikings. They are the ones who are invading everywhere. They're into England, they're into France, they go completely around Spain and into the Mediterranean. And as I said, they come from Sweden over to northern Russia and down that way. If you're looking for an invading army, you're basically talking about the Vikings. Now, it wasn't a concerted invasion, except for maybe the Great Heathen Army there that I mentioned in England. They got together and said, we're going to invade England. But most of the rest of it was just a couple of warriors got together, gathered some men who would come with them. They all took boats and they moved out. And you can't really call it an invasion, I don't think. It's more like a exploration by force, if you want to put it that way. They made sure that they were the strongest people locally. They struck fast, they struck hard, and then moved out. But they did mount some major attacks. They laid siege to Paris, can't think of the year, and it failed anyway, but they did aim high. They weren't just taking little villages whenever they could. If they had the manpower, they were willing to go for the big cities as well. Now, as far as defenses or defenses in this time were not the stone castles that you think of. That doesn't happen until maybe like the next century. The Normans, although they were getting more experience in using stone, at this point it was all like earthen parapets, rises up to wooden stockades like forts like you see in the old pioneer movies for the American pioneer age. Wooden stockades going around, built on a mound of ground so that the attackers would have to come up slope to it and then try to get over the wall. So you're looking at more primitive version, I think, than you see in most medieval movies. That's not something that most people picture about this time. Now, if it comes to a set battle in the open, the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in England, who were basically the same sort of people from the same area, both from around the Baltic and Northern Europe, they all fought on foot. They rode horses to battle, but they did not ride horses in battle. So you see them ride up, they all dismount, they send their horses to the rear, and they form shield walls. That was the dominant formation in warfare. Now, the Normans, who also appear in the book, they were descendants of Vikings as well, but they learned cavalry tactics from the southern Europeans who had ridden horses into battle, going the whole way back to Charlemagne and the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire. When he was spreading out his empire, he needed to send his men quickly to whatever part of it. It would have been France and Germany combined at that point. He needed to send his men quickly there, so they all rode to the battle, and eventually they just stayed on their horses and they established a kind of like cavalry tradition. The Europeans down there had a lot more experience with cavalry because the Huns had come over in the middle of the millennium and they were horse fighters, and you needed to have horse fighters to fight the horse fighters. So the Normans had more experience on horseback. But as far as the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in defense, you formed the shield wall that I talked about. You basically sent your biggest guys up with the shields. They were wearing armor the whole bit and just formed a line, a wall of shields with their spears sticking out through it and maybe swinging their Dane axes over the top of it. And as long as you had the flanks covered, as long as nobody could ride around it or get around it and outflank it, if you went from, I don't know, 2 creeks or hilltops or whatever, as long as people didn't get around it, it was basically impervious. Horses will not throw themselves on a hedge of spears sticking out of a shield wall. So that was basically couldn't be broken by cavalry. It evolved as an anti-cavalry tactic. The attackers, if you were going up against that, the Vikings had what was called a svinfløking, which translates to boar's snout. It was a wedge formation that concentrated all its fighting power in one point. And so the wide angles of the shield wall became irrelevant because the fight was not out there. The fight was all right where the wedge hit the shield wall. And right there, the Vikings, the attackers, would be trying to achieve numerical superiority right there at that one point where they could break the shield wall, divide the enemy forces, and then maybe defeat them piecemeal. And Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. If the wedge was not able to get through, the shield wall could close up on the wedge. And then you've got every medieval commander's nightmare, the double envelopment, where you're basically surrounded on two sides and the guys over there are throwing their spears into the middle, and there's no place a spear can come down except killing one of your men. So the Svinfylking, the fighting wedge, was really good if it worked and really bad if it didn't work. You had to basically size up the enemy line and see if you could pull it off or not.
Only 3 ways to break a shield wall that you talk about in The Last Viking. I'm gonna
Svinfylking.
I'm definitely mispronouncing
It might be Svinfylking. That's another word that I've never actually heard anybody say. I could be pronouncing it all wrong. It could be Svinfylking because it's pig snout, so it could be Svinfylking. I may have that wrong.
I was looking at that word and I was like, I'm not gonna try and say that. We can be wrong together. It's okay.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
I've noticed, maybe it's just where I hang out on the internet, but I've noticed a lot of, in military history in general, but especially like medieval military history, there's a lot of armchair quarterbacking where it's, oh, they could have done this and it would have obviously won the Battle of Hastings. And I was like, sure, dude. But we often criticize leaders of any era, but specifically this era, for bad strategy. Right. Like, we have the benefit of hindsight. But I've often wondered how much strategy in some cases would have been possible just because you're not necessarily working with a trained force. Like, you're not necessarily working with veterans. Like, Harald Hardrada comes back from Byzantium. He has a whole bunch of Varangian veterans with him. That wasn't necessarily a luxury every commander had. So, like, how much strategy could they have used?
Basically, you got your guys into a formation and the other people got themselves into a formation. Usually it was a shield wall versus a shield wall, or a shield wall versus a Svinfylking. And basically everybody that was on your side was facing this way, and everybody that was on the other side was facing towards you. And that's how you told them apart, because the two formations, the whole object was to maintain that formation and not get it broken up. We were talking about the shield wall there, and you mentioned the 3 ways to beat it. A Svinfylking or Svinfylking was one way, and I mentioned that you could try to get around it if it was possible. The other way, which really figured into the year 1066, there was like 3 battles and they all got lost the same way, was to do a head fake and act like you were retreating and run for it and make the other guys think, we have you, and they'll come charging after you and break their own shield wall. That was a third way to do it. As long as the two formations were together, you knew who was on either side because they're looking at you. If you manage to break the enemy formation, they've effectively lost the battle at that point. And if they're running, you chase after them and kill them. Now, the formations, the shield walls, like you say, Harold had his best men. All the commanders would have their best fighting men in the front with their shields, with their armor. These are all the best equipped guys, the most experienced guys. They're in there to fight the battle mostly themselves. Now, you've got a bunch of untrained and ill-equipped, like farmers, and they're called the Fyrd. They're all in the back. These are the guys who have no armor. They've just been called up to join the battle. They have wood hatchets and hay forks and stuff like that. And they're just there for the sheer numbers. And if everything goes well, they're not going to have that much to do. They don't have to know that much about strategy. You just keep facing this way. If our guys move forward, you go behind them. If they turn and run, you better run too. That's basically all the strategy is. And if the guys in the front did manage to break through and knock down a bunch of the enemy fighters, the farmers would come up with those wood hatchets and hay forks and finish off the wounded. So the vast majority of the army did not need that much professional training because the tactics weren't all that complex. There's the enemy, go at them. That's all it is to it.
I'm going to have to rewatch this and take notes.
There was, you had strategy in the sense of, like Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Fulford, whether he planned it or not, and he did the head fake and managed to get the English to break their shield wall. There's a little bit of strategy in that, and depending on the terrain, you might be able to figure out how to get around them, but basically it's like the enemy's over here, and we're here and they're over there. Let's go kill them.
I think this next question kind of ties into that, where I was asking about friendly fire in medieval combat, and you said that it's just the way the guys are facing. But do you have
Right.
anything to add to that?
This is before the era of heraldry when you had the shield designs for each personal guy. He had his own coat of arms. That's not happening yet, but the shields did have designs. You see a lot of the Viking shields with spirals on them and different runic designs, and that could identify the shield bearer. That could identify which side he was on, whether he was Viking or English. And the commanders usually had flags or banners marking their position. At Hastings, Harold Godwinson, he had the two-legged dragon of Wessex, the Wyvern flag, because he was, before he was King of England, he was the Duke of Wessex. And he has a personal banner called the Fighting Man, and that would be wherever he was on the battlefield. So if things were going wrong, you could look and see, oh, there's Harold's flag. He's right there. It's not moving backwards, so he's standing fast. We'll stand fast with him. If things did really fall apart and it came to a melee or something like that, you're probably beat if your formation is falling apart. Just run for it, because anybody who's still in formation can just plow right through you. I think there wasn't a lot of crossover or opportunity for friendly fire to take effect. The enemy was in front. All our ammunition, our arrows, our spears, everything is going over there. It wasn't a lot of opportunity to hit the wrong people.
Okay. Not as bad as I was expecting it to be.
That's not to say that in most battles, the one side did fall apart. That's how you won. And then things could get mixed up. But basically, all your guys would be moving in the same direction. And as long as you were with them, they were on your side.
This is switching gears. This is another topic I find very interesting. You do touch on this in both of your books, but could you tell us a little more about how the basic worldviews, morals, values, an 11th century Saxon, Scandinavian, or Norman would be different from our 21st century modern view? There's some things in there where you have disclaimers. You're like, this is bad to us, but they thought it was good. Can you talk?
There was a lot of that.
Yeah, there is a lot of that.
Yeah, times were different. You think of us now, our loyalty is to the nation state, and it's a lot wider focus. Back then, it was not such a wide focus. Your loyalty was to your kin, your clan, your family, and above all to your local lord. The feudal society was all cut up into these little chunks. The local villagers were loyal to the local lord, whoever he was. He could have been a knight, could have been a duke or something like that. They were loyal to him. He was loyal to whoever was above him. He had responsibilities to the king. He also had responsibilities to the people below him. So it was a very layered thing. You were not necessarily loyal to the next village over. They could be completely alien to a lot of people. Did not travel all that far back then. Travel was so difficult. It was either by horseback or foot that the average people might spend their whole lives just in their own little locale, and anybody from out of the area was other and could be enemy, could be friend, but you had no loyalty to them. Your loyalty was to your lord. If your lord decided that, yes, they were friends, they'll work together, then then that's what you did. But your lord decided your view and your values. If he decided you were going to go to war, you went to war. And he even decided your religion. If he was a Christian or a pagan, you were a Christian or a pagan. That was true even up to Tudor times when Henry VIII of England broke with the Pope. England was a regular Catholic country. And then Henry said, no, the Pope's going against my decision for a divorce here. We are Protestants now. And just like that, England became Protestant to the point where they persecuted Catholics. And that right up into the 17th century, where even in nominally Catholic countries, if your local lord was a Protestant, you were a Protestant. That's how they even decided the end of the 30 Years' War. They quit arguing so much over whose religion was right. They said, if this local lord here is Protestant or Catholic, all his people are Protestant or Catholic. And so your loyalties and your worldview all came down to you from the top. It was almost, I wouldn't say, you could say herd mentality. You followed the leader, and there was just no question of doing anything else. That's what all the people that you knew were doing. That's what you did as well. And as far as right and wrong, people back then had a different view of blood and death. I think they were a lot more familiar. than we are with it. They slaughtered their own animals, their own livestock, and they watched criminals being brutally punished, publicly brutally punished. Traitors, you saw Braveheart, you saw him get drawn and quartered at the end of that. That was the punishment for treason. And everybody, oh, let's all go see the drawing and quarter. They took a completely different view of it than we would. So right and wrong and life and death were two different things to them. And what we would consider right or wrong in this age had very little to do with what they considered right or wrong. What they considered right or wrong were what their lords told them.
This next question does lead into that. I was wondering if we could discuss a little bit about how Christianity did and didn't change Scandinavian warrior culture, because in some ways it goes both ways, where the version of Christianity that they practiced was very adapted to their culture at the time. So did it change Viking culture, or did they have their own version of Christianity?
I think the latter is pretty much the way it went. When Christianity came up, by the period that I'm writing about in the books, most of the Vikings were actually Christian.
Yes.
Now, were they Christian like we think of Christians? No, I don't think they were. Most of them, I think in the beginning, simply viewed Christ as being, or God, the Christian God, as just another one in their pantheon, amulets of Thor's hammer that are fashioned in the shape of a cross. And that was specifically done that way. They were specifically designed that way because that way you could be a worshiper of either God.
That's very efficient.
And I think they followed Christian principles as long as it was convenient to them, which I think you could say is true of a lot of people these days. But I don't think it necessarily in the beginning pushed out Odin and Thor and all the pagan gods. The Christian God was just one among many there. And you have to remember that in the Bible, there are really, and this might annoy a lot of your people as well, but there are really two Christian gods. If you think about the God of the New Testament with Jesus and a loving God, but you look at the Old Testament God, and man, he is not a loving God. He is a God of wrath. He ordered Joshua and the Israelites, ordered them to destroy Jericho and put every living thing in it to death. Not just the men, the women, the young children, the cattle, the sheep, the donkeys, everything. Exterminate them. This is the word of God, the Old Testament God coming down. And I think a lot of Vikings said, I could live with that. And I think that had a lot of appeal to him. The God that the Vikings were praying to was not the turn the other cheek God. He was a God of war to them. And if he was supreme over all the old gods, I don't think that bothered them. A lot of the overlords looked at having one God as a unifying way to control people. If you personally are of the cult of Odin, this village over here is of the cult of Thor, that's a division between you. They acknowledge Odin, but they're really fans of Thor. And that's a reason for them to maybe resist you a little bit. But if you can get everybody under one God in a religion where there are no other gods, that erases that cause of conflict. And I think that was a major appeal. I mentioned Charlemagne earlier. He was the one who created the Holy Roman Empire, and that unification was a big reason why he did that. And I think goes back to what I said about the Pope and the Crusades. He was able to unite all of Europe, which was just all this interfactional fighting, and get them all pointed in one direction towards Jerusalem and say, go over there and kill over there. And this is the Pope saying, go kill them. And when they took Jerusalem, I think they were supposed to have killed like 40,000 Muslims and Jews. The streets are supposed to have run with blood, and these are the Christians, and Christians are still catching hell about that today. They say that it's a hypocritical religion. I don't want to get into that, but Christianity did not necessarily repel Vikings. It wasn't something that they didn't want to have anything to do with. Now, some of them were forced into it. Harold Bluetooth, who was the king of Denmark, he lost a battle against the Holy Roman Empire, and the emperor at that time, Otto, said, hey, you are going to be Christian now because I won the battle. And that's basically what happened. He was baptized and like I said, took all his subjects and said, you are now Christian as well. Some of them did not like that, but that's basically how Christianity arrived in Denmark.
I've read a lot of books on the Vikings where it usually just stops. So they converted to Christianity. They're all into that now, but they didn't stop being Vikings when they decided, I think the Danes called him the White Christ, is what they called
Right. It was a Scandinavian name for him, right?
yes, that was not necessarily a very Christ-like church for the medieval period, but
Not in the modern view, no. They looked at it as just another king that they could justify doing, or another god that they could use to justify whatever they were doing at the time.
that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But where was I? Oh, here, I wrote it down. There's a line in The Last Viking, and when I got to it, this was before I knew that I was going to be doing this interview, but I loved it so much I
Mhm.
wrote it down. It was, "Men of consequence are not always heroic."
Ah,
And that was one line where I was like, oh, I wish I'd thought of that. I love that line so much. You do write about people who, like, we've touched a little bit on, like, they did things that were immoral by our modern standards, or even
mhm,
sometimes by their own standards. Like,
mhm.
Hardrada was called the hard ruler for a reason. But so as a fiction author, I try to be fair to my characters, but you're writing about real people. And do you have any protocols or processes when you're writing to try and be fair to your historical subject? There's only so much you can do for some of them, but
I, to tell you the truth, I don't really try to be fair to them. Like you say, these were real people. I don't add anything to the story. If it's said that they did this, then they did. And I don't have to justify it. I have to just say this is what they did. Fairness, for me anyway, doesn't really enter into it. I just try to write down what they did or what people say they did, and I'll leave it to the reader to make any judgment. I think everybody can agree that they had different standards in the past, and we can agree that those standards don't apply today. But I think it's a mistake to apply modern standards to those people back then. People back then did stuff that we would consider evil, and they did not consider it to be evil. I can't judge them on that, and I don't try to judge them. I leave it to the readers if they want to judge it. Like I say, people back then were much more familiar with violence and killing and death, and did not care so much if it happened to somebody else. That's just their mindset back then. We can call ourselves more civilized today, but I think you can go to many parts of the world and still find that to be true.
I didn't feel when I read your books, I didn't feel like you were picking on anybody. There are some books I read where I do feel like the author's picking on certain people, but that's interesting.
I do, yeah, I try to, I realize that a lot of my readers are going to say, what a terrible person. And I don't want to minimize it. A lot of what Harold Hardrada did later in life, he was a tyrant. He starts out as being, to me, a sympathetic character, and the power goes to his head. And I don't think he was a very nice guy by the end of the book. But I don't try to judge him on that. I just try to show what he did and let the reader decide.
Appreciate that. You do include a lot of anecdotes in your books
Hmm?
that come with disclaimers. So it's, here's what people said.
Yeah.
So there's a story about a monster snake in the Byzantine prison, like a gigantic snake that drips venom onto
Right.
Harald's arm, and a few other that are probably apocryphal or just extremely exaggerated. But how do you decide on what you include in your books and what's not? So does it have to be true, or is it just need to illustrate a point about the people?
It has to be true that people said that at the time. That's the part to me that needs to be true. I don't make up anything. I don't put words in anybody's mouth. All the quotes that are in the book were those quotes are actual quotes that are in the old sources. What needs to be true to me is that people said that or said that people did that, and that's what I put in the book. Actually, I went into a lot more detail in the rough draft about that monster snake because it's just like a fantasy scene out of Robert E. Howard. And I think in the draft, I did actually say this is a cliche now, but 1,000 years ago, when this story was being told, it was not a cliche. And so they told this story, and I put it in the book, and the editor said, this is just so completely over the top. Let's just summarize it and move on. And I think that was the right decision. Some of them you have to almost make fun of it. There's the story where the guy's falling down a cliff and he's hanging there by his coat on a tree or a branch or a rock that's sticking out, and an angel, or actually Harold Hardrada's dead brother, comes down from heaven and reaches down and saves him, pulls him up. That's obviously completely legend. But that to me is not the important part. The important part is that this is the story that was told back then. And I'm not trying to change the story, I'm trying to update it and make it accessible to modern readers, but I don't want to change it. If they said an angel came down from heaven and saved his life, that's going in the book. And all the readers can go, that's obvious BS. As well, they should. But that's what was said back there in the time. I'm just retelling the legends in these stories. And even what you take as fact after 1,000 years, I don't know how sure you can be of that. There's the story about the Viking on Stamford Bridge who supposedly held the bridge by himself with an axe and killed 40 guys trying to take the bridge from him. So that seems to be pushing it to me. It's a little iffy, but it's a great story, and that's what they said back then, and that's what I'm putting in the book. What the old scribes claim was said and done, that's part of history. That's the part of history that I'm telling. And if some of the things are a little too fantastic, again, the reader can figure that part out for themselves. I'm not trying to write a textbook, a history textbook. My rough draft, if you see my drafts where I put all the footnotes in, I submit two versions to my editors. I give them the straight text and then I give them the one with the footnotes. I think the last Viking had close to 1,000 footnotes. It was usually like every second or third sentence I was footnoting it, just so that I could say that I wasn't making this up, that somebody had said this or done this back in the time. But we take all that out because I'm writing a popular history. I'm writing it to entertain as well as educate. And some of these stories they're just fun to read about and write about. And even if you know they can't possibly be true, it's still fun to have it there and say, wow, that's pretty cool. They said that he did this. And I don't believe it. It's still entertaining.
I've never thought of it that way. The stories being part of history. That I like. I never thought of it that way. I like that.
Yeah.
Very cool. Do you think that there's a reason why Vikings are becoming popular again? In the past maybe 10 years, we've had.
Yeah, a lot of it is that TV show. The ones that I'm personally not a big fan. It's just not realistic. Right there again, I think they went beyond doing what I'm doing. I'm trying to retell the story, whereas they're like recreating the story. And to me, that's an overstep. I would not want to be doing that. And I think the stories are great the way they are. I'm not sure why they felt that they had to tamper with the plots and the characters, and why Harold Hardrada had to show up middle-aged 15 years before he was born. I don't know why they felt compelled to do that. And that's what turned me off. But I digress again. I think the Vikings are popular because of that TV show, whether or not I like it. A lot of people obviously do. And it extends into The Last Kingdom. And of course, the Game of Thrones and the Lord of the Rings. That's not history. That's only vaguely based in history. And the whole Game of Thrones thing is basically, he took the War of the Roses, I think, and threw some dragons into it and made a fantasy out of it. And that's just pure escapism. So they're trying to do something different from what I'm trying to do, which is basically just retell the story. They're going way beyond that as far as I'm concerned. And I think why it appeals to the audiences is because Vikings, we talk about what was good and bad now compared to what was good and bad then. A lot of these Vikings, they did what people can only fantasize about now, which is taking the world and not necessarily conquering, but taking the world and making the most that you can out of it and not letting anybody stand in the way. You look at, in my third book there, you find Forkbeard. He was born a bastard, was basically ignored by his father. And basically, he didn't personally kill his father, but he overthrew his father and went to England and basically created his own empire, the North Sea Empire, out of Denmark and Norway and England. Now, he didn't keep it for very long, but he did it basically all in the strength of his sword arm. And who can do that today? Nobody can do that. You have to fantasize about that. It can't be done. But back in that day, when good and evil were two different things, yeah, you could go and do that. And I think a lot of people envy that, even if they don't want to admit in polite company that they envy that.
I'm paraphrasing, but it does remind me of something you wrote in this book where you talk about there's an appeal in the honesty of how Harold, I want to conquer England, and he's very upfront about it.
Yep.
versus how a lot of our modern leaders couch morality around their intentions.
Right.
And Harold's, I'm just going to take it because I want to. And
Right.
I do think that is refreshing to a modern
I think so
audience.
too. You look at, and I don't want to get into politics, but you look at the country now, whichever side you're on, basically half the country hates the other half. And it's a lot of it is just due to the constant conniving of the politicians on both sides. And it's also backhanded and secretive, and nobody knows who to trust or who to believe. Harold was not like that. You knew right where he was coming from. I mean, he had a sword in a hand and he said, "Follow me or die." And that was basically it. And like I say, you know where the guy was coming from. If he was coming to you, it's like, ooh, I'm going to have to get on his side or else. And that's, like you say, it's refreshing. It's honest. It's honest. That's what it is. And I think we're lacking a lot of that these days.
I do suspect that's part of why Game of Thrones is so popular. But
Yeah.
but really good book. If everyone's watching, read it. That's coming to the end of my questions. But do you have any upcoming projects or where people can follow you, find you online?
Yeah, I'm about a third of the way into my third book of what has turned out to be a Viking trilogy. I didn't really set out to write a Viking trilogy, but the book that I'm working on is another Viking story. And as far as links to my books and a lot of my magazine articles are online free. You can go to my website, which is donhollway.com. Hollway is Holway. It's not Holloway, it's Hollway.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited. Yeah, there's another Viking book coming. I will definitely
Yeah.
be watching for that.
This is the hard part I'm at right now. Like about a third of the way into it. It's once you get over you're a writer. You've written books. Once you get over the halfway point, the end is in sight. I'm still in the uphill slog on this one right now.
So I believe in you. You can do it.
I think I can. I think I can. I think I can.
And I'll pre-order it when it drops in my multiple editions too. But thank you so much